The Historical Society of Ottawa acknowledges that as we share these stories from our past, we are on what remains the unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode. This series is a collaboration between the Historical Society of Ottawa and Rogers TV. I'm Ben Weiss. I'm with the Historical Society of Ottawa, where we've been telling Ottawa's great stories since 1898. If you find Ottawa's history as fascinating as we do, I urge you to check out our website, our monthly speaker series, and follow us on Facebook, and enjoy today's segment.
Hi, welcome to Beechwood Cemetery. I'm Nick McCarthy. I'm the marketing director for Beechwood Cemetery and Beechwood Cemetery Foundation. Over the course of the next little while, we're going to talk about this cemetery that grew in really early Ottawa and how we became the National Cemetery and the National Military Cemetery of Canada. So you can imagine that cemeteries are really like libraries for people. There's all kinds of tales and all kinds of stories, and we're going to walk through 150 years of Ottawa history, of Canada's military and RCMP history, and really see ourselves where we find ourselves connected to this hallowed ground. So we'll start in early Bytown, because we can't really speak of Beechwood Cemetery without talking about our really foundation of the city prior to Ottawa. So in early Bytown, we had the cemetery where Parliament now sits, called Barracks Hill. Barracks Hill was this sort of smallish cemetery meant for the people of Bytown, but as you can imagine, Bytown had that lumber boom, which we're going to speak a little bit about later, and we outgrew this early cemetery of Barracks Hill. So from 1827 to about 1845, there was this tiny little cemetery that everyone was burying their loved ones. And at a certain point, we needed the space, and we needed to remove these cemeteries, these urban cemeteries, from the downtown core. So along comes Sandy Hill Cemeteries, this burial ground that was meant to serve the community for a long time, but never really was big enough to actually meet the needs. So from 1845 to 1872, we find ourselves burying our loved ones just off of Rideau Street, which wasn't really in Ottawa at that point, a little further off into the country. But cholera hits, we have different diseases that we see, and then people have a mistrust for these early cemeteries and a mistrust for the disease around cemeteries at the point. And all of a sudden, the city starts looking for new land and new places outside city limits. Even though we can see Parliament Hill behind me, we were outside of city limits at one point. And we have Beechwood Cemetery. And the story goes that they were looking, some of these early business entrepreneurs, your Curies, your Mackays, your Blackburns, were looking for sort of property for a large cemetery. And Notre Dame Cemetery, the Catholics had already built their cemetery in 1872, right on just off of Montreal Street, right next door. But at the early time, they were looking for a large piece of property, and they were in the Westboro area. They were looking at sort of what's Hintonburg now as the early cemetery, but also as a large piece of land. But thankfully for us, and thankfully for somebody who works at Beechwood, they quickly changed their mind, and these really early lumber barons, entrepreneurs, found Beechwood, found the lumber on the property, and quickly started buying up property, which was in the larger Mackay estate, or what is New Edinburgh now. And Beechwood is born. And Beechwood is born not as a religious cemetery, but really as a cemetery that serves all different kinds of community. And this has been a defining moment in our history. So our early founders are people like Robert Blackburn, Joseph Merrill Curie, Thomas Mackay. Then we have the Kiefer family. And these are all big names that we all know nowadays. Mackay created Mackay Castle, which is the Governor General's residence now. Joseph Merrill Curie, one of the founders of Red Patch Sugar, had an illustrious career up and down a little bit, but he ended up building 24 Sussex, which then becomes the Prime Minister's residence years later. But here we have this sort of like early cemetery, right? We've got this cemetery that's trying to find its identity. And in 1873, we look at Beechwood from the bit of the American pastoral model. And so American pastoral design in cemeteries are these long winding roads, these up and down hills. For anybody who didn't Army Run, these up and down hills were very apparent during Army Run. So Beechwood becomes this very much garden cemetery, really focused on sort of how the community interacts. And in 1873, we're founded, and September 13th was to be our founding date. And we have these talks, these really early talks of what Beechwood's going to be and how it's going to be. But the consecration actually happens about a month later in September. So September 13th, 1833, there's a bit of a storm. Apparently, this is how the Ottawa Journal described it. The weather was not nice. And trekking all the way from downtown Ottawa at the time to Beechwood, which was the great countryside of Ottawa, or New Edinburgh, if you will, was a little too perilous. So on October 25th, 1873, we find ourselves consecrating the ground. And this is where we're going to talk about the 200-year march to Beechwood becoming the National Military Cemetery. So for those who may not know, we're a National Historic Site twice over, and I'll talk about the two different. One as an American pastoral cemetery, those long winding roads, the hills, the garden-like state. The other one we'll speak a little bit later when we're talking about the Ottawa Chinese community and the impact they had on our corporate culture here at Beechwood. But Beechwood's destiny really lies in this first monument. So on October 25th, 1873, all the famous people of the city of Ottawa, all the big names that this series will talk about, all got together around Captain Forsyth's monument. And Captain Forsyth was the commander of the Ottawa Field Battery. The Ottawa Field Battery was the battery that essentially guarded the mouth of the canals from our American cousins, and of course had some skirmishes with the Fenians, which I think you'll later on in the series somebody will talk about that as well. So you can imagine all these people surrounding a military monument, which becomes the oldest military monument in Ottawa. And this is where Beechwood is born. This is where Beechwood is made sacred. And the Ottawa Journal talks about the weather being a little cold, so the fairer people in the city, of course the women at the time, did not attend this unveiling as they had planned. But this marks this defining moment in who we are, that over the course of 153 years, we start developing a history with the military, a history with the serving community. But in 1873, 1874, we find ourselves really embracing the garden model. And we've got this great garden that we're in right now called Beechwood Botanical Gardens. And by 1874, the Ottawa Journal was often talking about how people had to come to Beechwood to visit not only the gardens, but to see the trees and see the landscaping. Because at that point, we had no more urban cemeteries. So urban cemeteries were less garden-like. They were more utilitarian than what we're known as now. So as we move through this history, Beechwood got so busy in 1874 that we had to issue tickets for people to come in, almost as if we needed crowd control at the time. But Beechwood evolves and becomes this place. And over the course of our history, we find transforming itself. And I spoke about the Chinese community, and as early as the 1900s, 1904, the first members of the Chinese community start being buried at Beechwood. And by 1903, we really start looking at how can we provide services for this new community. And within that first decade of Ottawa's history, we find the Chinese community building the Ottawa Chinese Cemetery within our ground. And it's the first cemetery that has its own identity. It's built within a cedar fence, a cedar location where it's really young laborers, people, single men who can't return home, who may not have families here in Ottawa. But the Hume family and a few other large prominent Chinese families by the 1920s built a bustling cemetery for us, with working with Beechwood, of course. And in the cemetery, they build monuments and they build dedicated burial space guided by a religious doctrine and their own cultural practices. And so this is really the start of Beechwood as this multicultural. And of course, prior to that, we see sort of the English, the Irish, the Scots, some French communities. There was Germantown as part of New Edinburgh. And we see these communities come in and they build monuments and they build large estate monuments. And it becomes the place where people want to be seen. The main entrance of Beechwood at that period was sort of facing Lansdowne, sort of more on the Hemlock side, and you had to slowly crawl through what's our woods now to come up. And as you would crawl through that, you'd see sort of these prominent families in Ottawa, the Slaters, the Bronsons, the Rochesters, and you would it's almost as if you'd have to pay tribute to these people as you were bringing your families to be buried at Beechwood. And each big family decides to build their own monuments. We'll just talk about the Booths, right? This great lumber baron family. They decide to build a giant, tall monument. And of course, when we're taking people on tours, the concept back then was the taller the monument, the closer you are to God. And the Booths definitely tried to raise themselves as high as possible at this period. But the real fact is, the taller the monument, the bigger the monument, the more likely 100 years later we're going to speak about your history and about your family. And we see this sort of ethos through Beechwood coming about. So from 1873 till about 1910, Beechwood becomes a community cemetery. It becomes the cemetery for those politicians, early Ottawa families. One of the most prominent funerals was actually John Bower Lewis, and this is really early on, January 1874. John Bower Lewis, who was a mayor of both Bytown and a mayor of the city of Ottawa, as well as the second police commissioner of the city of Ottawa. He has his burial here at Beechwood, and it was a day of mourning across the city. And I think that's a moment of legitimization for Beechwood. But now we approach the 19th century, and that changing doctrine of what cemeteries are meant to be. And we see the big estate lots sort of disappear. Queen Victoria kind of sours funerary rites and cemetery rites at this point. Her mourning was seen as too long. We're approaching a great war. And people's ideas of how to bury people are very, very different. And that forest park lawn model, the garden model, kind of makes way to a different format. And we see sort of a little more densification and more focused on housing the dead than celebrating the life of the individual. So flash forward to the First World War. Or really the first conflict that Canada sees itself with, the South African War, as it was then known, the Boer War. We see the creation of these small military sections, these military enclaves at Beechwood, where these people regroup together and create Beechwood buries military soldiers together. The first, of course, being this old Last Post Fund in the center of the cemetery. And it's not a very visited location, but it's these flat markers of soldiers who would have served right at the beginning of the South African War and would have also served during the First World War. And it was a last post section, and for those who don't know, it's for soldiers who are destitute, who don't have any families to provide these burial rites. Many of these soldiers list the Minister of Defense as the next of kin. So as the war happens, as World War I happens, Beechwood starts sort of catering to the military community, and we see ourselves welcoming people like Ernest Cruikshank. Ernest Cruikshank was the father of the military battlefields movement and the historical sites. So again, we find ourselves burying the people who create historical sites, which Beechwood then becomes later on in life. We also find this young artillery commander who serves during World War I called Major General Edward Whipple Morrison. In the South African War, he was just an artillery soldier, and he knew a young man called John McCrae. John McCrae becomes famous, of course, for In Flanders Field. And this is a story I like to share because I think it's important to understand that the friendships that are forged in battle can really have different effects. And so the story goes that John McCrae wanted to re-enlist to serve in World War I, and he called his friend he was the doctor for, Edward Whipple Morrison, and asked to join the regiment. And at that time, you weren't allowed to be a soldier and a doctor. There was very much a distinction. So we see Edward Whipple Morrison quickly create the regimental surgeon. The regimental surgeon is this uniformed soldier. And I'm going on a tangent, but it'll be great if you just follow suit. So Edward Whipple Morrison, his best friend John McCrae, he creates a position just for John McCrae as a frontline soldier and a doctor. Flash forward to the Battle of Flanders. We lose a gentleman called Arthur Helmer at that battle. Arthur Helmer's family is from Ottawa. He's memorialized. It's said that he was one of the inspirations for John McCrae. John McCrae writes in Flanders Field. He's not, the story goes from the archives and from the memoirs that John McCrae wasn't really too keen on this poem, but Edward Whipple Morrison is. And as a Major General, he managed to get it published. And within weeks, the idea of In Flanders Field as a remembrance poem becomes very, very important. And we see this young artillery commander buried at Beechwood, talking about, and we're able to remember him and his contribution. So we're seeing the war period at this point at Beechwood really affecting the landscape. After World War One, there's this wonderful in-between period where we see large businesses coming to the city of Ottawa, and we see people like Thomas A. Hearn building up industry, building up LeBreton Flats. We see the Herdman Brothers. We see all kinds of big businesses coming and really finding their places within the seat of power. Believe it or not, Ottawa was one of the places where streetcars were fabricated across and were shipped across the country. You had Wiley Willie Washington with Thomas Ahern building these incredible streetcars, taking up city blocks, and then, of course, fires and other things happen, and we lose our transportation industry here in Ottawa. And I'll leave you guys to judge where we're at this point. But 1920 also marks a defining moment in Beechwood. We build the Beechwood